want to welcome you all back to our conference. Just remind you again, we're not to bring food and drink into this room. It's because it's just all going to be done in high-tech, etc. And invite Alex Mikulich of the Detention Social Research Institute to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Alex.
Good morning. Good morning. It's my honor and delight to introduce Professor Miguel de la Torre. And I want to begin by asking you all a question. Where would you begin to do ethics? What would be your starting point for doing ethics? Now, for most theologians and Christian ethicists, their starting point would be something like the good, what is the good, or what is the beautiful, or what is it to live a virtuous life. Okay, but our speaker this morning begins with a different question. The question that he asks in one of his latest books is, what happens when you fry bologna? Has anyone here fried bologna? Do you know what happens to the bologna? It bubbles up. Okay, while we may chuckle, I think that it's a profound starting point for ethics because it challenges us to reflect on our social location. Where are we at in this privileged place in university within the U.S. empire? And how do we relate to people who are oppressed within this empire, who may not even have the means to fry bologna? So Professor de la Torre begins with locating himself within the experience of Latina, Latino, and Hispanic peoples. And he calls us to passionately attend to the experience of marginalized peoples in the world today. He has published numerous books where you can learn about where he goes from the question of frying bologna. These books include Reading the Bible from the Margins, Doing Christian Ethics from the Margins, a delightful book on the prophet Jonah. It's entitled Liberating Jonah. And Latino Social Ethics, Moving Beyond Eurocentric Moral Thinking, which came out last year. And also Trails of Hope and Terror, which is an impressive collection of testimonies about immigration by immigrants, border police, border activists, ranchers, day laborers, and many other different perspectives of immigration. Now, before he started asking the question of frying bologna, he's lived many lives that include he worked 13 years as a realtor, and also he has a political past where he was a Republican candidate on the same ticket with Pat Robertson. So perhaps there is hope for us. And he presently serves as professor of social ethics and Latino studies at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. Within the academy, he has served the Society of Christian Ethics as vice president this past year, and next year he is becoming president. And it is a real delight for me to introduce him, because I know him as a colleague who has been very generous with his time and energy for me personally in times of need. So he's an extraordinary colleague and someone who I look up to in the work of doing Christian social ethics. So please welcome Professor Miguel de la Torre.
Buenos dias. On June 21st, 1960, I received a letter from the Immigration and Nationalization Office. It said I was in violation of Section 242, which basically means I overstayed my tourist visa. I came to this country as what some today would call illegal. The question that I want to ask before we talk about detention is, why am I here? Or more specifically, why are Latinos, Latinas, Hispanics are in this country? And I want to try to reframe the answer. Because usually what we respond is, well, they're here looking for freedom. Or they're here looking for jobs. Or they're here to suck up our social services. All of those answers are wrong. I am here as a direct result of U.S. policies in my home country. And until we reframe the question as to why they are coming, we really can't begin a conversation about detention. I am here, Hispanics are here because of bananas. Yes, bananas. In 1970, Americans were first introduced to bananas. 1870. By 1899, they were eating over 16 million bushels of bananas a year. Literally, they went bananas over bananas. Seeing an opportunity to make money, a corporation was created by the name of the United Fruit Company, whose main purpose was to meet the needs of Americans wanting bananas. And the best place to grow bananas was Central America. Hence they began, where we get the term, banana republics. Now, one example, we'll look at Guatemala. Manuel Cabrera was the dictator of Guatemala in the early 1901. And what he allowed the United Fruit Company to do was to protect their interest in the growing of bananas. During this same time, the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, well known for running up some hill in Cuba, which was really unimportant, we had a good PR person, he gave us this phrase called gunboat diplomacy. And we remember also the other phrase, speak softly but carry a big stick. And what Teddy was trying to tell us is that the full force of the U.S. military was at the disposal of corporations like the United Fruit Company to protect its interests and therefore allow bananas along with other resources to flow into the United States. So by 1950, 70% of the land of Guatemala is controlled by 2.2% of the population. Jacobo Arbenez is democratically elected as the president of Guatemala. And he tries to pass some very minor land reform. And I say minor because this was already going on in other countries throughout Latin America. He had just one minor problem, the United Fruit Company. Now, fortunately for them, they had two allies in the Eisenhower administration, the Dulles brothers. One was the Secretary of State, and the other one was the head of the CIA. Now, one of those Dulles brothers also used to be, before being appointed by Eisenhower, the attorney for the United Fruit Company. So they did a covert CIA operation to overthrow a democratically elected government in order for the United Fruit Company to protect its land holdings and therefore continue to grow bananas. This led to a 30-year civil war. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, massacred, disappeared, but we still make a good profit. Now, the engineer of this covert operation was the head of the Guatemala desk at the State Department. He ends up becoming the CEO of the United Fruit Company after he finishes his job with the government. Now, for the hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans, they're faced with a choice. Either they fight or they flight. And many chose flight. Now, what happens in Guatemala happens in every other country along the Caribbean basin. My country, lovely land of known as Cuba, it was sugar and tobacco that was being reappropriated for the benefits of U.S. corporations. Hold on to that thought for a second, because there's another part to the story as to why we're here. And it goes a few years prior to the 20th century. And that's called manifest destiny. A beautiful term we learn in our history books. But what it really means is that the U.S. gets to appropriate half of Mexico. Now, yesterday we talked about it's not the border, it's not the Mexicans who are crossing the borders, it's the borders that cross them. But more important than that is that the borders cross the natural resources of Mexico that were important for Mexico to develop as a powerful economic force. All the gold of California, all the silver of Nevada, all the oil of Texas, all the natural harbors, with the exception of Veracruz, that were along the California coast. Manifest destiny allowed the borders to cross over these natural resources in the early 1800s that allowed the United States to have the starter-up capital to get their industrial revolution going. While Mexico lost all these resources and thus have been unable to get their economy going because those natural resources went up north. Matter of fact, Andrew Polk, when he was running for president, ran under the campaign slogan that if I'm elected, I will invade Mexico. He was elected. A month later, he invades Mexico. When he's elected, one of the representatives, John Quincy Adams, who used to be president but now was in the House of Representatives, stood up and said, and I'm quoting pretty much, "I fear today that the banners of our nation shall become the banners of tyranny." Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in that war, while he's dying of throat cancer, is writing his memoirs, and he says, reflecting back to what happened in Mexico, he said, "Just as God punishes individuals, God also punishes nations. And I fear that the Civil War was God's punishment upon us for what we did to Mexico." So we knew that manifest destiny was wrong, but we still did it because it was profitable. Now, we're no longer really invading other countries to take their land. We're more sophisticated than that. We now invade them to take over their economies. And I want to just give you one example, and that's NAFTA. And I just want to focus on one item, and that's corn. Corn, as you know, was born in Central America. It is the miracle crop that could be grown in high altitude, low altitude, a lot of rain, little rain. When, from Central America it spreads to the north and to the south. When a lost Christopher Columbus is discovered by Native Americans, he takes this corn and brings it back to Europe. It really feeds the people. Now, the World Bank, which is really no friend of the poor, they themselves says that the major cause of poverty is the $1 billion a day we spend to subsidize crops in industrial nations. Corn, from 1995, the start of NAFTA, to 2004, was subsidized in the United States at a tune of $41.9 billion. And of course, this will continue because where do we hold our first caucus elections for president? In Iowa. Now, it's cheap. What happens is, once NAFTA comes into place, it's cheaper to buy corn than to grow corn. So you have all these farmers who can no longer grow the corn by which they fed themselves. A third fed themselves, 2/3 they sold on market to buy the necessary things. And you can say, well, these corn prices went down. Not so fast. Because of NAFTA, you eliminate the trade barriers, and therefore corn prices plunged by 70%, the other essentials of living increased by 247%. So there was no windfall even for corn, because tortilla prices went up by 483%. Therefore, 1.7 million farmers lose their farms once NAFTA comes into place. These farmers who lost their farm has no place to go but go up to the maquiladoras in the northern border. And if you've ever been in Nogales and you look over the wall, you see a golden arches, and you realize that you're making $5 a day. I'm sorry. Yeah, $5 a day, $20 a week. And you look across the border and you see a golden arches, and where a pimple-faced teenager is probably making $5 in an hour or two. There was a tremendous draw up north. Now we could say, well, this is why we have an immigration problem, and that's why they're dying to death. But what we fail to realize is that a couple of months after NAFTA was signed, we put into place Operation Gatekeeper. What a coincidence! If only we knew that our NAFTA policy was going to create this immigration problem, maybe we would not have done NAFTA. However, in 1993, the year before NAFTA is ratified, the GAO, the Government Accounting Office, does a report for Congress. And in that report they say, if NAFTA is passed, we will have an immigration problem. Hence, Operation Gatekeeper, which closes the border in the traditional places where people usually cross. People would cross from Tijuana to San Diego, go up to Washington, pick apples, and then when the harvest is over, they'll come back, go back home, and work their own farms. And you had this even flow of people going and coming back. When you close those borders, you push everybody to the desert, where the crossing becomes highly dangerous. Now, we know they're going to die. This is what our policy says. We know some people will die crossing the border. But that's okay, because it will deter other people from crossing the border. You know how good that worked? Yeah. Here's the important thing. Not since the days of Jim Crow do we have official policies that are based on people with brown skin dying to maintain social order. This is by far the greatest human rights violation occurring in this country at this time. So why do we come? This is important, so listen up if you were sleeping. When one country builds roads into another country for the purpose of extracting their cheap labor or their natural resources, why should we be shocked that those same people are taking those same roads, following everything that has been stolen from them? I am here in this country because of the sugar and the tobacco stolen from my people. Now, we good Christians talk about how do we deal with this immigration, and here's where the reframing needs to occur. Because our answer is, well, we need to show them an ethics of hospitality. There's an issue of hospitality. We need to welcome them into our home, and we need to, take care of them, and we need to make sure. No, that's all wrong. Because hospitality assumes a power relationship in where the one giving the hospitality owns the house, and out of their goodwill, they are sharing a room in their house with me as long as I behave myself. What is missing from that analysis is that it is my resources and cheap labor that built that house in the first place. And I want my damn house back. I am not here to receive hospitality. I'm here to receive restitution. How much do we owe for a century of gunboat diplomacy, which, by the way, we now call regime change. What do we owe for all that we have stolen and all that we have reappropriated? And once we begin to look at the immigration debate under those lenses, can we move to the problem of detention and what we do with those who are here following everything that has been taken from them? Well, we call them illegal and we throw them in jail. Which I always found the term illegal interesting because basically the person just doesn't have proper identification papers. So for those of you who drive, if you were to leave your house and leave your wallet at home and you get stopped, you're not called an illegal driver because you don't have proper papers. You just get a little ticket and you go on your way. But if you happen to be Latino or Latina, that's a whole different story. For example, Juana Villegas was giving birth at Nashville General Hospital in Meharry, Tennessee. Now, while she was giving birth, her leg was handcuffed to the bed. And in the room was a sheriff making sure she didn't escape during the giving of birth. Her husband, of course, was barred from the room. When the baby was born, the baby was separated from her mother and she was taken back to jail without a breast pump. What was her crime? On July 3rd, 2008, she was driving without a license. And because she happens to be Hispanic, they ran her name through the system and find out that she has been in this country since 1996 without proper papers. Now, it's not just that she, who represents so many, is put aside because she doesn't have she's undocumented and doesn't have a license. But it also means that every Hispanic, whether documented or not, must prove that they belong to prevent for them happening what happened to Juana Villegas. Now, there's a report that just came out about the No More Deaths Crossing the Line, which you can find on their website, which documents the abuses that are going on in our detention center when immigrants are being picked up. That's www.nomoredeath.org, if I'm not mistaken. For example, 3 individuals, 3 women and 2 children, the children 14 and 16, were picked up while crossing the border. So the guards, to prevent them or to make a deterrent for them not to cross the border again, forced them to run for 30 minutes in the desert while pushing them into cacti, kicking them, and mentioning derogatory ethnic slurs. Now, we could look at these guards and say what horrible people these guards are. And that's an exception to the rule. But when we say that, we ignore the fact that what's going on in how we detain the undocumented is an institutional violence that is not pinned on one individual, but as the entire structure is designed to create this type of violence. When a mother and her 2 children, aged 6 and 9, were in detention and they were asking for water, the guard went ahead and poured himself a glass of water and drank it in front of them. When a 21-year-old woman, to make sure she wasn't concealing anything, was asked to remove her top and to lie in the center of her cell, that is institutional violence. When a 17-year-old girl is searched by male guards and is improperly touched, that is institutional violence. The report shows over 345 testimonies that were collected that basically confirms what Amnesty International has already declared, that in our detention of the undocumented, they're denied food, water, medical attention, and instead are given verbal, physical, and psychological abuse. Many human rights organizations, legal scholars, and the United States and the United Nations have meticulously documented how U.S. policies continually violates international human rights. So we should not be surprised when an HIV transgendered woman by the name of Victoria Arena dies because the guards refused to give her medicine at the facilities in San Pedro, California.
I was there.
You were there.
I was there.
We should not be surprised when Itma Arroyo is picked up in Providence, Rhode Island, and he dies of epilepsy attack, while his sister's outside begging with the medicine, please give it to my brother. And of course, we should not be surprised when Sheriff Arberio from Phoenix, who forces his men who are undocumented to wear pink panties as a form of humiliation, and gives them spoiled and rotted bologna to eat as their meals. No wonder the mayor of Phoenix, Phil Gordon, accuses the sheriff of infringing, quote, infringing on the civil rights of its residents, unquote. So our treatment of detention of the undocumented obviously violates human rights and dignity. And it's very easy to say, well, they do it because these people are just horrible folks, which they probably are. Or to say, well, they're all just racist, which many are. But the real reason this is occurring is because it is profitable to violate these rights. In 2009, ICE detained 383,524 undocumented aliens. From 1994 to 2008, those numbers of undocumented in detention multiplied by 5 times. The custody budget for holding the undocumented leaped from $860 million in 2005 to $1.72 billion in 2009. This is a money-making operation. And until we start looking at the economics of detention, we really can't begin to understand how to deal with the detention policies. According to the Emory Law Review, detention is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Most of the 300 facilities are contracted out. It costs ICE, and this is important, it costs ICE $95 in 2009 to hold one undocumented immigrant in detention. This does not include medical, this does not include transportation. It costs the private facility to hold that one undocumented immigrant $12 a day. And of course, the more that you could reduce that cost of $12 when you're getting paid $95, the more profit your shareholders make. In a 2009 report, the 17 most populous facilities that house 50% of all the detainees were managed by 75% of the private firms. I mean, 75% of those numbers was managed by private firms. The 2 major companies being Corrections Corp of America and GEO Group, which in 2008 earned $325 million from ICE contracts. Now, because this is big business, and if you're a good businessman, you need to have lobbyists in Congress, and they have their own lobbyists. And these lobbyists are pushing to increase detention. The more people who are arrested, the more money they are making. Heaven forbid we actually reduce the number of people in detention. It would hurt profits. It would hurt the community who is benefiting from these jobs. And as long as you're willing not to deal with the human rights issues, you could make a lot of money in this business. There is no substantive legislative or regulatory standards governing these detention conditions. The Department of Homeland Security internal standards, they themselves say, are poorly enforced and often not even binding, according to the UCLA Law Review. Because these are not U.S. citizens, there is no need to have any type of regulatory government oversight. So they literally, to use a Latin American term, disappear. But that's okay. We make a lot of money by this. So therefore, what is the Christian response? For many Christians, the response is found in Romans 13:1. Let every person be subject to the government authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. This is the law. We need to obey it. I have a little problem with that. I prefer King's response, which he says, and I quote, one who breaks an unjust law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accept the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of a community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. We're not going to change this detention policy. It makes too much money for too few people. To try to change it, you're going against major economic players. So the question becomes, how do we begin to screw with the system? To raise the consciousness to the injustice that is going on right now. You see, institutional violence is an affront to any person of faith because of this concept within Christianity that we call the imago Dei, which is a fancy word for the image of God, that every human being has this image, that they're created the very image of God. And to violate that image is to violate God herself. The question that we're faced is, what is our responsibility as Christians? Better yet, what is our responsibility as humans? Because the way our silence and our complicity with these structures of institutional violence denies us of our very humanity. Now, for those of us who are Christian, Jesus says that on that day, the heavens will roll away, and I will establish my throne in the earth. And I will gather all the people before me, and I will separate them as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goat. And I will look upon the sheep, and I will say, now come, enter into the rest that has been prepared for you since the foundation of the earth. For I was hungry, and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me to drink. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was an alien among you, and you took me in. I was in prison, and you visited me. I was sick, and you came to me. And surely they would say unto the Lord, but Lord, when? When were you hungry and thirsty or naked? When were you an alien? When were you in prison? When were you ill? And surely I would say unto them, that which you do to the very least of these, you have done unto me. Now let me make this clear. If you want to see the face of Jesus, he is the one who is hungry. The immigrant crossing the desert is about a 4 to 5 day journey, and they have about a 1 day of supplies. In the work that I do on the borders, I come across people who literally can't walk because they have no food in them. If you want to see the same face of Jesus, they are the thirsty. They leave Altamento with 1 jug of water, which lasts them about half a day to a day. And by the third day, they're drinking, in many cases, their own urine to be able to survive. You want to see the naked? Again, the immigrant. Because of unscrupulous coyotes and because of bandits, to make sure that they rob them of everything, they strip them of all their clothes in case they're hiding anything. And we have come across people walking the desert with no clothes on. Of course, the alien is obvious. If you want to see the person who's in prison, well, we said there was 383,524 of them who are Jesus. And if you want to see those who are ill, I have done interviews and had conversations with individuals who have kidney failure because of the dehydration that they went through while crossing the desert, as well as the other physical ailments that come. So you see, we can't even begin, for those of us who are Christians, call ourselves that, when we ignore the very face of Jesus who is found in the undocumented immigrant. Hence, Mark Twain, I think, said it best. If Jesus was to come to us, one thing he would definitely not be, and that is a Christian. Shame on us. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you're not allowed to bring any water or liquid into this place. So please don't do that. Yes.
Not to be a fundamentalist about the scriptures, but I think it's very interesting that passage from Matthew is a judgment on the nations, yes, not just on the individual.
No, I think you're absolutely right. To read the biblical text as though it is speaking of individual is to impose upon it a Eurocentric, hyper-individualistic reading. It was always meant as a reading of people, of nations. And you know, on that day, Copernicus will rise up and bear witness against the United States. For we who say we have the truth have totally ignored it. Yes?
So there was recent trade agreements with, I think, South Korea and 2 other countries. How do you think that's going to affect the immigration?
Yeah, I know that the trade agreement was passed a few days ago. I haven't really looked at it very carefully. And Asia, Southern Asia is not my area of expertise. But when we look at countries like South Korea, we look at Singapore and all that stuff, I think a lot of, you know, the tigers of the, I think is what they call them, I think a lot of it, a lot of the success was to become a, you know, like saying, well, communist China, that's evil, that's bad. Here we have these good countries who are democratic, and let's follow them. So it was a good, you know, a good part of the PR. I'm wondering how that's going to work out. Like I said, I haven't read the freedom agreement yet, but I'm not hopeful, because once you allow the corporations to move borders and not let people move borders, you start creating this chase for the lowest common denominator. You know, we moved our jobs to Mexico because they were willing to work at $5 a day. But now, you know, Singapore is willing to do it for $2.50, and China is willing to do it for less, so we're moving our jobs there. And we have to be careful because Vietnam is willing to do it for $1 a day. And of course, half the day, you know, we're all, you know, so the country member willing to do it for 50 cents a day. So our rush to the lowest possible denominator it's just not good. Well, yes, sir, back.
You're well published as a theologian, and you're very well published as a theologian, and your area of expertise is U.S. Latino theology, as I read it, and you're well published in that area. In particular, are there theologians who you'd recommend, especially U.S. Latino theologians, who you recommend that we read, or you put on a short list as a series of must-reads, perhaps including 1 or 2 of your own books?
Well, in a shameless act of self-promotion,
That was my question.
yeah, the book that was talked about earlier, Trails of Hope and Terror, Testimonies on Immigration, which, interestingly enough, I only wanted to call it Trails of Terror, the publisher inserted the word hope over my objections, because I didn't find much hope on those trails. But that's a side thing. Elizabeth Gunter-Fraser just put out a book on the children, testimonies from children of immigration. I don't remember the title off my hand. I know my dear colleague just came out with a book as well, which I think is in the flyer in your book, in your packets. So there are some good books out there. Christians on the Border by and he has an article in my book, and his name escapes me right now. Harold Carroll, yes. Help me out, Carroll. No, Carroll's his last name, right? Yeah.
Carroll M.
Yeah. So those are some of the books I would recommend, but I would not limit it to just theologians and ethicists. I mean, most of my research, I obviously did not get it from them. I think we need to be also aware of the economic ramifications of what's going on and the social policies as well. Yes, and then we'll go here.
This question isn't directed to you, but it is prompted by what you had to say and what our other speakers had to say. So it's mainly for people here from the university, particularly in leadership. Are Loyola and Tulane, do we have investments in Geo Group and CCA? Anybody know?
Actually, on the panel later today, we'll actually, Mary Bowman will present the fact that we have just, the Jesuit province bought stock in both of those in order to file stockholder resolutions about human rights. I can't tell you what the university's portfolio is, but when you hear Mary sing, you'll hear about the complexity of this, but it's a new approach to trying to address these issues.
And that's becoming very popular with, and this is my screwing with the system idea. You start buying stock in these corporations, you go to the board meeting and then protest what they're doing. And they let you. And yes, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you for your profound and moving statement. And I actually want to follow up on that idea of screwing with the system and raising the injustice. It would be so great to hear from you some other ideas, kind of stepping outside of the legality box that we're all squeezed into, to hear your thoughts, as a person of faith, to raise that consciousness.
Yeah, in the book that you mentioned, Latina social ethics, moving beyond Eurocentric thinking, I wrestle with this idea of how do we do ethics when, if I want to protest police brutality, I have to go to the police department to get a permit from them so I can protest it. And then they'll give me a little space someplace where I can do that, away from the cameras. And then I feel good about myself because I was out there protesting, but nothing changes. So how do we begin to think in ways that, may mean, jail time? Not that we want to go to jail. I always like it when my white students all want to go to jail because they want to get their street creds. It's like, I know many of the black and Latino students who are willing to go to jail and pushing to do that. So the idea is not to go to jail because that just ties up the funds that could be used for the cause. That may be a consequence. So how do we begin to dance with this system in a way that just continuously tries to nick away at it, one chip at a time, but in the hope of raising this consciousness. And I think that's what groups like this to begin to start thinking really creatively as to what to do. Yes?
You mentioned agricultural policy as being important to this debate. I think the Farm Bill is up for renewal next year. What are your thoughts on maybe one or two reforms that would be possible, given the political climate, that would be helpful?
Yeah. Here's my only concern with reform. It seldom changes anything. Because neoliberalism, the globalization of the economy, is so far ahead of us that before we even reform anything, they already have 5 or 6 steps as to how to nullify whatever we just reformed. And that sounds very pessimistic. And I'm the first one that say I am totally hopeless, which leads me to the extreme of how do you screw the system now. We're not going to win. as long as Iowa continues to be the first place that picks their presidents, and you have to win Iowa, you're going to still have subsidies to corn, regardless of what it says at the Capitol. And even if that's limited or if that changes, it's not going to be enough to change these structures and the way they operate. So, giving ideas of reform, I have some difficulty with. I'd rather just, lighten the highways and block the trucks carrying the corn out. That might be more effective. Yes, sir.
Really enjoyed your talk. I want to thank you for bringing it today. I'm not so sure that, let me ask the technical question first, and then let me get the philosophical question. The technical question is, you said it was $95 and then $12, that's per day, I assume.
Per day, yes.
Per day. All right, here's the philosophical question. You don't think we're going to win, okay, because they're so far ahead of us. But when you start thinking about, see, I'm from Nebraska, which is close to Iowa, and grow corn there too. But one of the things about people in the middle region of the country that I think is different from my experience to my perception of people who live in the South and West is that because they really don't engage with a whole lot of people of color on a daily basis anyway, and as a consequence of that, they tend to be a lot more accepting of people of color in those places. When you give them like an academic or intellectual argument, they're like, yeah, that makes sense, we'll do that. So you see a lot of interesting social justice things come out of the Midwest and out of places like Minnesota that you wouldn't expect to see. I'm not so sure that I will prevent you from doing anything. That might be the winning part, is that it's an Iowa. The other thing that I was going to say is, when I'm thinking about, and if you're active in a movement, you've been doing it all your life, and you're getting old and middle-aged, and you start going to see doctors for things you didn't think you'd ever see doctors for, you start saying, well, why am I doing this? What have I won from this? But at the same time, you see these things that are happening, like the bees disappearing, like this corn blowing all over the place that's genetically modified, that then becomes a monoculture, that all you need is one worm to get in there and it's all going to collapse. You see the economic problems that we have. Your line about the Civil War being punishment for all the wrong that was doing, if there is some punishment on the stage that's coming, that opens up possibility for something new, what is it that we need to be planning for? That's the question.
Good question. And that wasn't my line, that was Ulysses S. Grant's line.
Yeah.
Right.
Proper attribution understood.
When I say I'm hopeless, and I am, it becomes middle-class privilege to be able to say, well, there's nothing I can do, so why bother? For those who live on Saturday, on Holy Saturday, between the crucifixion on Friday, the death and the torture and the blood and all that, and have no idea of any resurrection that may come on Sunday, to live in that space is where I'm living, and I think most marginalized communities are living, does not afford us the luxury of middle-class privilege to say, why bother, nothing's going to change, why keep working? My parents, may they rest in peace, continue to fight to feed their children in spite of the structures being designed against them. It is that hopelessness that I think propels us to do the action, regardless. And here's the ethical question. Am I doing this praxis and this action because I think I'm going to win? Or am I doing it for the sake of justice, regardless of what the outcome is? And for me, I continue to be in a fight, not because I think I'm going to win. I'm not that optimistic. I continue in the fight because I have no other choice. But like with Amos, to call down justice like living water and righteousness to flow like an everlasting stream. That's the reason that quest for justice regardless. So what do we do? I'm afraid that many times white middle class privilege is very quick to get to the solution. If we just create this one committee and we do these 3 or 4 acts, we'll get there, we'll pass the legislation, we all can go home and we won. We're very quick to get to Resurrection Sunday. We're very quick to get to, we've made it. I'm saying, sit in the dirt with me, like Job, on Saturday. Let's just cry. Let's be real here. And then when we get off the dirt, whatever strategies we begin to develop, it's not with any false illusion that we're going to be successful, but it is with the commitment that we are going to stand for justice, regardless of what happens. I have 5 minutes left, so I think I could ask 1 or 2 more questions. Yes?
Hi. I tend to agree with the perspective you were putting out about the whole issue regarding foreign policies and military, control and so forth in other countries and what role that plays in people wanting to leave. But I've often been kind of perplexed by, because I know that that's kind of a more critical perspective of migration than just simply kind of the narrative that you're putting out. But I tend to be perplexed by the question about then why do people stay in those countries, right? Because how do we explain kind of who's leaving, why they're leaving, versus the overwhelming majority of people who don't leave, even though they're subject to the same things. And what does that tell us about kind of the politics of migration, either leaving those countries or coming into other countries, right? And why do they go to the countries that they do? I didn't know if you could kind of address some of that.
Why do they stay and not come, is the question, yeah. No question, I mean, I'm familiar more with why they come because of the violence that we've exported. I understand that. The state, the other thing I could tap into is, quite frankly, if I had a choice, I ought to be in my own country. I mean, who wouldn't want to be in their own culture? I went back to Cuba a few years ago, and I was feeling great because I'm among my people. This is it. Here's where I belong. And then I had one street hustler come up to me and say, "Where are you from?" And with great pride, I said, "I'm from here, Havana." He looked at me and said, "You may be from here, but you're no Cuban." and this pain that I'm too American now to ever be Cuban, and I'm too Cuban to ever be American, I think really wants me to have stayed where I belong. Does that make sense? I mean, that's just one individual trying to wrestle with your question. That, I want to just basically be, I want to be among my people, among my food, among my culture, among my music. But circumstances had other, beyond my control, pushed me here more than I wanted to come.
I'm a sociologist, and a couple of years ago I went with a group to Mexico, and we went out for a day. It was a migration conference. We went out for a day to a little village, and the only people there were the elderly and the children. And I don't know if the statistics show this, but it was mainly the working age men who were not there because they were working here, probably. I don't know if we have the demographics on that, but I think that's part of it, at least, the people that can get the jobs here.
There was a big trend in the 70s and 80s for the main, the eldest son or whatever, to move from their village or their city and send money back. And the problem that we as immigrants, because I am an immigrant, would do and see is that we give a different picture of what we here in the United States do. Here in the United States, we live 14 people to a room. We try to make ends meet. But when we go to Mexico or in our other countries, we spend money like we just swept it off the streets, And because the city that my husband belongs to, because of the money that was coming from the eldest son from different homes, the city grew. their houses changed, their streets were better. And it was a benefit for both sides, for Mexico and for the here United States. United States needs labor. They don't make children in the United States. They don't make an existing labor, an upcoming labor force. So, and they were able to provide and make homes in Mexico and other countries in South America, in Peru, Ecuador. The same scenario follows. And so that we can continue one of a solution, because there's 20 million solutions, is to bring back the Bracero program with checks, real good check stubs, because people want to stay in their land. I know a lot of Mexicans that were here, and it says all they talk about is about going back to Mexico. They never expected to stay here, but situations asked to do it differently. But to keep their farm in their lands and help the labor force here in the United States, I think this is one solution. Everybody needs to work at the different solutions, because immigration is not a simple problem.
Thank you, yeah. I know our time's up, but let me just say one last quick thing. As we think about solutions, as we think about strategies, as we think about what to do, we need to also be very aware that it took 100 years to create this immigration problem that we have today. One comprehensive legislation bill is not going to fix the problem. It may take several centuries before we ever allow justice to again return to how we deal with issues of immigration. So we also need to be very pragmatic and realistic as to what we are facing. Thank you very much for your time.